So, welcome everybody. Very good to see you here in such numbers, especially in this drizzly weather. And a big welcome too to our online audience. It's a great pleasure tonight to introduce you to Rosie Dean, the Consul General here in Sydney of Ireland. Rosie has been Consul General of Ireland in Sydney since September of 2021, and prior to that was working in the Irish Embassy in London as Brexit First Secretary. Her academic background was in history, politics, sociology and law, and she worked subsequent to university in finance in international corporations and later joined the Irish government's Department of Finance and then the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But here she is with us tonight. Her subject on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Ireland's membership of the EU is Ireland's journey from being, as she has put it, an isolated island on the periphery of Europe with a small economy to being one of the most open, globalised and progressive societies in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Rosie Dean.
Thank you very much, Ian. Is this okay? People can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Before I begin my remarks, I just want to acknowledge the land on which we stand, which is Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This year, Ireland celebrates a number of important anniversaries. It's 100 years since we joined the League of Nations, 50 years since we joined the EU, and 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement brought peace to the island of Ireland. Tonight, however, I'm focusing on Ireland's 50 years of EU membership, and it's my hope, over the next few minutes, that I will be able to sketch out Ireland's journey from a social, economic and political perspective. And if you'll indulge me too, I will include some personal narrative, as my journey has on occasion found me at the coalface of some important moments in our recent history. But just a bit of housekeeping, if I may. Although when Ireland joined the EU, it was known as the EEC, or the European Economic Community, just for ease, I'm going to refer to it throughout my speech as the EU. I'll also refer to the Taoiseach, which I know some of you will know means the Irish Prime Minister, so the Taoiseach, Irish Prime Minister. And finally, I'm going to take you through this journey in phases, so there'll be about 5 phases. So with that, I'm going to start with phase 1. It's on the eve of Ireland's on the eve of joining the EU in 1973. So we joined the EU in 1973 as a relatively poor, underdeveloped economy. We relied on the UK for our trade, and they alone accounted for 55% of merchandise exports. We also had a very narrow export base, which was predominantly agriculture related, with food and live animals accounting for 41% of our exports. Of a population of just under 3 million, Ireland had just over 1 million people at work, and only 27% of that workforce were women. Thousands continue to emigrate each year to the UK, US, Canada, and of course Australia. And Ireland indeed is no stranger to population loss, and we are unique amongst developed countries in having a smaller population now than we did in 1840. To illustrate this, before the famine, Ireland's population in 1840 was 6.5 million. But over years of, obviously the direct effect of the famine and subsequent migration, we dropped to our lowest point of 2.9 million in 1966, just a few short years before we joined the EU. Life expectancy too was pretty low. In 1973, came in at 70 for men and 73 for women. And socially too, we were a deeply conservative, largely Catholic country, one in which homosexuality, divorce and contraception were all banned. Men and women didn't receive equal pay, and women were obliged to leave the civil service once they married. 1972 was also one of the most violent years in the Northern Ireland Troubles. 479 people lost their lives that year, and countless other lives and livelihoods were destroyed. It was also the year of Bloody Sunday and the introduction of direct rule from Westminster for Northern Ireland. For many Irish people at the time, my parents included, their only option lay abroad. And during the 1970s, my parents, both of whom came from rural agricultural backgrounds, emigrated to London in search of a better life. Naturally, there was a deep desire in Ireland for change, so it was unsurprisingly when that change presented itself in the form of a referendum on EU membership, Ireland voted overwhelmingly in favour, 83% to join. And on the 1st of January 1973, we joined with Denmark and the UK. It seems a little ironic now, given all that's happened with Brexit, but it's worth pointing out that our decision to join the EU was in fact owing to our trade reliance on the UK. In 1966, a free trade area agreement came into effect between Ireland and the UK, and this meant that Ireland actually had no choice but to apply to join the EU when the UK decided to join, as had we failed to do so, tariffs and other non-tariff barriers would have been reimposed on our main export market. So now we're into phase 2, which is the early years of EU membership. I suppose it's probably best to say that the results were mixed during the early days of our EU membership, and it's worth bearing in mind that at this stage some of the EU economic, infrastructure such as the single market was some distance in the future. Ireland started to rapidly catch up initially in terms of equality, most notably through the introduction of the Equal Pay Act, guaranteed parental leave, protection for pregnant workers, and the removal of the marriage bar for women in the civil service. These developments were a direct result and also an obligation of our new EU membership. Irish farmers also benefited and began to receive guaranteed prices through the Common Agricultural Policy. Additionally, as an underdeveloped economy, including from an infrastructural basis, Ireland gained access to EU structural funds, and from 1973, Ireland was a net recipient of over €40 billion in EU funds. However, Ireland was also experiencing the downsides of being a small fish in a pretty big pond, namely being an underdeveloped economy trying to compete with more advanced economies in the EU. Additionally, as a newly minted open economy, we felt our vulnerability to external shocks acutely, not least the impact of the oil crisis in the 1970s. By the mid-1980s, Ireland had a very poor report card. We had massive borrowing and tax rates, an overvalued currency, low foreign direct investment, and these issues resulted in high unemployment at 15%, falling real wages, growing public debt, and a devaluation of our currency by 8% in 1986. Immigration in the 80s was approximately 450,000 people, meaning that a shrinking tax base had to shoulder even higher tax burdens, so not a terribly attractive location for investment. And all the while, too, the Troubles continue to rage in Northern Ireland. But despite all of this, Ireland was beginning to see some green shoots of economic improvement, which ultimately became known as the Celtic Tiger. There was no single factor that transformed the Irish economy during the late 1980s. Rather, it was policy decisions, including earlier ones, and our EU membership, which began to mature and reap benefits. Commentators often subscribe Ireland's economic transformation to our corporation tax regime. And while, of course, this did play a significant role in attracting foreign direct investment during the 80s and 90s, I believe its impact was secondary in comparison to the effect of freeing up trade had in addition to our membership of the EU single market and educational reform. But going back to 1987 for a moment, Ireland needed a major programme of recovery and reform to breathe life back into our economy. And this came in the rather sombre-sounding Programme for National Recovery, which was a social partnership agreement jointly produced by the government, trade unions, employers and farmers' bodies. The programme had several elements, including tax reform, social welfare, health education and housing reform, macroeconomic measures to stabilise the national debt to GMP ratio, and employment and labour legislation focused on job creation and promoting investment through flexible labour relations. However, crucially, the programme also contained a dimension on the EU, one which encouraged closer economic integration with and the fullest participation in the European Economic Community, which Ireland embraced with aplomb. The European single market took legal effect in 1993, and put simply, the single market allows goods, services, money and people to move freely within EU countries. This was an absolute game changer across Europe, but in particular in Ireland. The single market not only brought to an end the customs border which divided the island of Ireland, it also diversified our trade markets and consumer base, bringing Ireland from an economy which at one time relied on one trading partner for over 50% of our trade, to an economy which has access, as do companies in Ireland, to a market whose GDP is now valued at about €15 trillion, and has a consumer base of 450 million consumers and 20 million companies. Education too has and continues to play a really crucial role in Ireland's economic growth. Free second level education was introduced in Ireland in 1967, and this was followed by the abolition of third level fees in 1995. To say that these decisions were transformative doesn't quite cut it. Today, Ireland is ranked third amongst the 38 OECD member countries for the rate of third level educational attainment. Some 54% of Irish people have achieved third level education. And if I may, I'll use a personal example to demonstrate the effect of this education transformation which took place in Ireland since the 1960s. My father was the eldest of 10, and none of his brothers and sisters made it to third level. In fact, most of them didn't finish second level. In contrast to that, I'm one of 28 first cousins. 26 of us have third level education. So I think that happened in one generation is quite remarkable. Okay, now I'm on to phase 3, social change, the peace project, enlargement of the EU, the Celtic Tiger, and a more confident Ireland. So fast forward to the year 1998, and Ireland was in an altogether different space. In this year, Ireland had the fastest growing economy in the industrialised world for the 5th consecutive year. Real Irish GDP growth was averaging about 9% since 1994, and real Irish incomes increased by almost 2/3 since the beginning of the decade. Ireland's embrace of international markets was apparent when in 1997 Ireland's total exports and imports were equivalent to over 155% of GDP, compared with just under 100% in 1987. The Celtic Tiger was well and truly roaring in Ireland. 1998 was also the year in which peace finally came to Northern Ireland after 30 years of conflict. During the course of the Troubles, 3,500 people lost their lives, and countless others had their lives and livelihoods destroyed. I don't think there's any one reason as to why peace finally came to Northern Ireland in 1998, but in my mind, I think there was a number of factors at play. For peace to happen, both sides needed to talk. And since our entry into the EU, the Anglo-Irish relationship grew deeper and became more diverse. While we undoubtedly shared concerns in relation to Northern Ireland, working together at an EU level showed the many other ways in which we were like-minded, for instance on issues such as agricultural policy and the capital markets. These close working relationships helped to establish and develop working relationships more broadly and including, crucially, at a political level, as was so well demonstrated during the tenure of British Prime Minister Tony Blair and Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, whose personal and political relationship was fundamental in terms of the creation of the Good Friday Agreement. This relationship was bolstered too by transatlantic allies, most especially the support of US President Bill Clinton, whose contribution to the peace in Northern Ireland cannot be overstated. But another crucial ally too was the EU. The EU's role in the peace process in Northern Ireland is often overlooked, as is the fact that the EU actually started out as a peace project with the founding of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1950, which was created as a way to connect and reconcile France and Germany after World War II, essentially using trade as a conduit for peace. The EU had a defining impact in bringing peace to Northern Ireland. It did this through the facilitation of dialogue and mutual understanding between parties and communities. As I already mentioned, common EU membership and regular meetings in Brussels at the beginning of the 1980s fostered more positive Anglo-Irish relations. But the European Parliament too was a forum for reconciliation. Within the EU, parliamentarians are grouped according to their political views rather than their nationalities. And this was important as it provided another neutral forum within which representatives from Northern Ireland, Ireland and Great Britain could come together and build relationships and trust with one another on different issues. The benefits of this can be seen in the creation of the EU Peace Financial Package for Northern Ireland, a support package which still operates today. Its creation was due in no small part to the cooperation of 3 Northern Irish MEPs in the European Parliament who came from different sides of the divide. The 90s and the noughties were also a time of huge social and attitudinal change in Ireland. The grip of the Church on Irish society weakened considerably in the 20th century. Cheap travel across Europe, as the 20th century drew to a close. Cheap travel across Europe and schemes such as Erasmus, which is Europe's study and work programme, introduced young Irish people to different values, experiences and outlooks. Ireland has become a country of net inward migration, something which has continued to this day and has enriched Irish society. The opening of Ireland in every sense of the word, which began in the 90s, would go on to have profound positive effects, most notably in the passing of the same-sex marriage referendum in 2015, with Ireland becoming the first country to do so by popular vote. This vote was followed by the rescinding of the ban on abortion later, 2 years later, something which could not have been conceived of 30 years ago. Ireland grew in confidence too and sat more easily around the EU table. By the mid-noughties, Ireland had successfully held the rotating presidency of the EU 6 times, including during 2004, when we, as president, presided over the largest ever enlargement of the EU, in which 10 new countries joined the EU as member states. And that is something that continues to be a source of great pride in Ireland. Ireland also joined the single currency, the euro, in 1999. And this was a very important moment for Ireland, as it showed how far we had integrated with and indeed seen our future firmly within the EU. If you will recall, Ireland was carried along in the UK's wake when it applied for membership of the EU in 1973. Fast forward 26 years later, and when the decision came to stay out of the single currency alongside the UK, Ireland struck out and opted for the euro and a step away from the UK. While this was an important step for us as a nation, our entry into the EU also opened up a world of cheap credit, which will go on to have some pretty devastating consequences. So to close out this phrase, I want to quote that saying, all good things must come to an end. So phase 4, EU treaty rejection, global financial crisis, and of course Brexit. During the noughties, Ireland encountered some speed bumps in terms of our rejection of the EU Nice and Lisbon treaties. I'm not going to go into the detail about these treaties, but suffice to say that this was a bit of a wake-up call in terms of our EU journey. There was a general apathy amongst the general public to these treaties, and this, coupled with low voter turnout and what we would now call fake news, led to shock defeats of these referenda. This was an important lesson for us to learn as a country in terms of underscoring the need to maintain and foster public support of European integration, not just in the run-up to referendums, but as an ongoing project and on a long-term basis. We couldn't take our membership for granted. However, these speed bumps paled in comparison to the impact that the global financial crisis had on Ireland. There isn't enough time to go into the origins of the global financial crisis, but what I will seek to do is to explain specifically the impact it had on Ireland. The economic crisis that hit Ireland in 2008 stemmed from an uncontrolled, credit-fueled real estate bubble, which inflated both residential and commercial prices, driving individual indebtedness, reducing overall competitiveness, and encouraging an over-reliance on property-based taxes in the years from 2003 to 2008. The collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008 and other large institutions caused the markets to lose confidence and to move away from higher risks which included Irish banks with large property exposures. When confidence evaporated, there was no soft landing for Ireland. The move away from higher risks took the form of the withdrawal of short-term liquidity, leading to the failure of some Irish banks. The effects of plummeting property prices quickly spilled over into the rest of the economy, causing distress and difficulties for borrowers and savers. And this also had a very real human cost, one in which homes were repossessed, unemployment increased, and immigration increased. The response to this crisis was multifaceted and comprehensive, and it included a large fiscal adjustment to restore order to the public finances. It also included bank guarantees, capital injections, into the domestic banking system, and of course an EU IMF support programme. In addition to the domestic responses, owing to the interconnectedness of the global financial system, and the systemic importance of some financial institutions, a global regulatory response was required, and it was in the midst of all of this action that I joined the Department of Finance in 2013. It was quite the introduction to working in the EU and indeed in working in the regulatory space, and I ended up working with a team of colleagues which introduced many of the EU's regulatory responses, which ultimately reinforced the EU's financial infrastructure framework. It included reporting requirements, capital requirements, and stress tests on financial entities. While it's impossible to predict what will happen in the future, and indeed the interconnectedness of our global system as another layer to consider, nevertheless, from an Irish perspective, the crisis, although difficult, has resulted in a domestic financial system and regulatory landscape which is considerably stronger than that which existed before the financial crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm onto the home straight now, so bear with me. Of course, I couldn't tell the story of Ireland's EU journey without mentioning Brexit. By 2016, I had promoted into the Department of Foreign Affairs, and when the time came for my first posting, I was sent to London to become Deputy Director for Brexit, which I'm sure you can imagine I spent a rather busy 4 years. The story of Brexit is long and complex, and I cannot go into all of the elements, but for the purpose of today, I'm going to focus on the impact on the island of Ireland. Following the announcement by then British Prime Minister David Cameron that a vote on the UK's membership of the EU would take place, thoughts in Dublin turned to the potential impact of the UK's exit on the island of Ireland. These implications range not only to impacts on our close trading relationship, but the close people-to-people links and the operation of the common travel area between our islands. And of course, particular concern was raised about the impact that Brexit would have on Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. During my time in London, I was often asked why Brexit would have an impact on the Good Friday Agreement and why the EU and Ireland took a very strong position on this issue very early on in the negotiations. First and foremost, the Good Friday Agreement brought to an end 30 years of violence in Northern Ireland. To quote the former Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney, the Good Friday Agreement provided a framework for all of the relationships on our two islands between communities in Northern Ireland, between North and South on the island of Ireland and across the Irish Sea. In a practical sense, the Good Friday Agreement removed the hard security border which operated on the island of Ireland. It also established a devolved power sharing administration and created new institutions for cross-border cooperation and structures for improved relations between the British and Irish governments. And importantly too, the Good Friday Agreement contained a commitment by the British and Irish governments, and I quote, to develop close cooperation between their countries as friendly neighbours and as partners in the EU. Joint membership of the EU and the removal of barriers and the provisions of the EU peace funding are some of the elements which lay at the heart of the success of the Good Friday Agreement. It was very clear, therefore, to Ireland and the EU that the potential ramifications that a no-deal Brexit or a hard Brexit could have on this agreement, and that is why the protection of the Good Friday Agreement and the avoidance of a hard border on the island of Ireland was of paramount importance, not just to Ireland, but to the other 26 member states. I think you're all familiar with the evolution of the Brexit debate since 2016, but suffice to say it's been a complex journey, in particular for communities in Northern Ireland. But I'm heartened, however, that there's been progress in recent weeks, and recently the EU and UK welcomed the formal conclusion of the Windsor Framework. This framework is a set of joint solutions that comprehensively addresses the concerns raised by people and businesses in Northern Ireland, while providing stability and predictability that people and businesses do need as well. It will also provide momentum towards early restoration of all the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement for the benefit of people in Northern Ireland. Crucially too, this agreement also opens up a new chapter in EU-UK relations, allowing us to forge a stronger partnership to address shared global challenges. The agreement also provides an opportunity for an improved British-Irish relationship, which has been so vital for peace and prosperity on our islands. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this rather frenetic whistle-stop tour of Ireland's 50 years of EU membership. I know that I've bombarded you this evening with a lot of information, but if you'll indulge me for just a few more minutes, I want to revisit some of the statistics that I mentioned at the start, and as a demonstration, I suppose, a comparison to today, as a demonstration of how and why Ireland remains a proud and committed EU member state. So to recall, when Ireland joined the EU in 1973, we were a poor, underdeveloped agrarian economy which relied on one country for over 50% of our trade. Of a population of just under 3 million, just over 1 million people were employed, with women making up just 27% of the workforce. Life expectancy was low, and Ireland was a deeply conservative society, and each year thousands of young Irish people left for opportunities abroad. The Ireland of today is just unrecognisable. Today, Ireland's total trade with the world exceeds €840 billion, a record level. The EU is our largest destination market, accounting for 34% of our exports, while the transatlantic relationship with the US accounts for 20% of our exports and is of growing importance. The UK remains a key trading partner, but the diversification benefits of EU membership has meant that this accounts for just 10% of our goods export currently. The Irish economy is the fastest growing in the EU and has one of the highest levels of labour productivity in the world. Owing to our significant economic growth, Ireland has gone from being a net recipient of EU structural funds to being a net contributor to EU structural funds to help newer member states achieve infrastructure development. Ireland has become a diverse country and a country of net inward migration, and just last year our population exceeded 5 million for the first time since the famine. Over 2.5 million people are at work in Ireland, and over 54% of people in Ireland have a third level education, and those rates are even higher when you look at the 25 to 34-year-old range. There's 63% educational attainment levels. We also now have the highest life expectancy in the EU, and today I'm expected to live for an average of 84 years, while my male counterparts will live for 81 years. But those stats are just a snapshot of modern Ireland and a demonstration of how 50 years of EU membership has been critical in terms of shaping the country that we are today, one that is progressive, prosperous and open. Before I finish, I just want to thank Ian Lincoln and the board of the Australian Institute of International Affairs for inviting me here to speak here this evening. And I want to thank you all for your attention and for coming out in the bad weather to hear this our journey of EU membership. Thank you very much.